Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's event here at the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. I'm Anthony Rowley, former president of the club, and I'll be acting as moderator for today's event. And let me straight away apologize for the delay. It's largely my fault, I'm afraid. My computer is sometimes very slow, so my deep apologies. Okay, well, Mr. Carrasco, I do hope you can hear us from Spain. Can
I certainly can. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me and see me.
I can indeed, and I particularly apologise to you because you're not here in the room. You didn't see what was going on. But anyway, let's move on. So today's event is the latest in what we call our deep dive events, in which we ask panels of experts to look at topics of current interest. And I think everyone would agree that today's topic is definitely of current interest. We've called it Red alert for a climate change disaster. I know that sounds a little dramatic, but you know, as climate change continues to become worse and manifest itself in scary heat waves and forest fires and floods and disease and so on, I think many more people are willing to admit that, you know, the seriousness of the problem. So we've gathered an impressive group of experts here today to discuss this very important issue. Let me introduce them in the order that they'll be speaking in. Online from Spain, I'm not quite sure which part of Spain, but is Mr. Bruno Carrasco, who is Director General and Chief Compliance Officer for Sustainable Development and Climate Change at the Asian Development Bank, the ADB. We have Mr. Akio Takemoto to my right here, who's Program Head at the United Nations University Institute for the Advanced Study of Sustainability, a leading research and teaching institute based here in Tokyo. And then to my far right is Hajime Takizawa, who is Policy Researcher at the Climate and Energy Division of the Institute for Environmental Strategies, Japan, IGES. And last but certainly not least, to my left is Mr. Fletcher Harper, who's Executive Director of GreenFaith, an international multi-faith climate movement, to add a different perspective. Okay, well, I'm going to keep my comments very short because we have overrun the starting time, unfortunately. But, you know, obviously, since the COP26 climate summit in Glasgow last November, things have, if anything, appeared to get worse. So we'll be looking at where things have gone or haven't gone since COP26. And we'll also be looking forward to some extent at the priorities for the COP27 summit, which is due to be held in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt in November, later this year. So let's get straight down to work with the opening comments from Mr. Carrasco. As I said, he leads the ADB's bank-wide knowledge, innovation policies, and strategic in thematic and sector operation areas. He oversees the administration of trust funds and global funding initiatives and provides advice to management on strategic and policy matters, work plans, and major operational matters. He holds a doctorate degree in economics from the University of Essex in the UK. So, Mr. Carrasco, please, if you wouldn't mind.
Thank you very much. A very good afternoon to everyone. I'd like to begin by thanking Anthony Rowley and the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan for their kind invitation to this deep dive event on climate change. It's a true honor to participate in this event. I am coming in from a very hot and sweltering Madrid that has just gone through almost 3 weeks of heavy, hot temperatures. My apologies, of course, for not being able to join you in person. In today's presentation, I would like to structure my reflections across three major themes, namely the challenges of addressing climate change. And we're taking a little bit more of an ADB perspective, an Asian Development Bank, Multilateral Development Bank perspective. Secondly, I would like to present ADB's commitment to climate change as we position ourselves as the climate bank for Asia and the Pacific. And finally, I would like to share some brief considerations on some of the climate change challenges. So to begin on the first theme, if we look back at COP26 in Glasgow, if there is one soundbite to recall, I would say it's the COP26 president, Mr. Alok Sharma, concluding that limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius was still within reach. Perhaps the last minute compromise on the wording of, quote, phasing down unabated coal power from the ideal phasing out was seen as a concession that described, in some ways, the hard-fought negotiations that took place. However, there was an important achievement, and this is with the reference to, quote, phasing out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. This is a first in the UNFCCC process. And perhaps this sums up COP26 and what ultimately stuck in many people's minds. Now, moving on, there's no doubt that COP26 brought many challenges and opportunities to addressing climate change. Collective commitments were unfortunately found insufficient to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. Now, of course, this highlights a first message that I would like to leave with you, and that is the urgent need to significantly increase the level of ambition of nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, between now and at least 2030, and map a credible pathway. And I think that we need to emphasize the credibility side of things, credible pathway to reach net zero targets. The NDC commitments are, of course, a very important first step. However, a greater challenge would be on the implementation, the understanding, and the linking of commitments with financing. So in some ways, what we're looking at is making sure that those commitments are funded, and that allows for a greater level of ambition across countries. Now, it is true that following the postponement of the Glasgow COP26 from 2020 to 2021, it was an impressive achievement to simply have proceeded with the event. The Glasgow Climate Pact, the key document outcome from COP26, acknowledged the devastating impacts of the coronavirus pandemic and the importance of ensuring a sustainable, resilient, and inclusive global recovery, and showing particularly solidarity with many of the developing countries. It has emphasized three important considerations in our view. First, it has emphasized the urgency of enhancing ambition, action, and finance for both mitigation and adaptation, thus giving adaptation its due role. Second, it called for parties to accelerate the development, deployment, and dissemination of technologies and the adoption of policies to transition towards low-emission energy systems. I can share with you last year, we approved our ADB energy policy. There was a lot of discussions. On the one hand, many of the regional DMCs, developing member countries, want to recognize the importance of energy access, energy security, and many of our other members highlighting, of course, the importance of climate change and sustainable development. So we need to find, in some ways, a middle path that can address both these considerations. Third, it also recognized the need to ensure a just transition. And this is an important theme that came out of COP26. And we expect that to have further analysis and considerations in COP27. And of course, here we're talking about the importance of minimizing dislocations to workers as they search for alternatives as we close down coal powered plants. And this, of course, brings the point of the multidisciplinary nature of this work. We need to focus more on things like training and skills to facilitate the cost of adjustments that are implied in a transition to a low carbon economy. Now, for multilateral development banks like ourselves at Asian Development Bank, the Glasgow Pact has recognized the importance of our institutions to further scale up investments in climate action, and of course, to enhance mobilization of finance to deliver the scale of resources needed to achieve the climate change plans, and particularly on adaptation. Many of you will recall that during the 2008 global financial crisis, central banks were considered, quote, the only game in town, close quote, to address the crisis. Now, while not going that far, I would surmise the greater appreciation of the multilateral development bank's roles in addressing climate change. And I would say this basically comes down to three key features, namely the pipeline of bankable climate change investment projects that we as the Asian Development Bank have in place. Second, our ability to leverage private sector financing, recognizing the resources, particularly the private financing that will be required to address many of the climate change challenges. And not only leveraging this financing, but working towards de-risking the pipeline of these bankable projects through guarantees, syndication, and co-financing. Not to mention, of course, not to forget also our green bond programs. And then thirdly, we have an element of soft power, what we refer to as our convening power, and our ability to work closely with policymakers across the region to develop a policy dialogue, to be able to raise that level of ambition that I was referring to before as far as the NDCs are concerned, and look at greater ways of relaxing some of those constraints and allow us to invest more into climate change reforms and overall investment. Now, ADB recognizes the challenges that our developing member countries face in enhancing and achieving their climate commitments, including, of course, the transition towards or away from fossil fuels. We know that countries face important trade-offs in terms of prioritizing a limited set of scarce resources. We have seen the limited fiscal headroom following on the large fiscal stimulus that followed on the pandemic, and the various challenges in terms of not just economic recovery across many of our countries, but also competing demands on investments in such things as digital technologies, health, and education. So the choices are certainly stark, and those decisions need to be made conscientiously and using very, very sound judgment. So this reiterates the urgency in meeting the climate change commitments that we have set for ourselves as an institution. Now, going to the second theme, as Asia and the Pacific's climate bank, and with the battle of climate change to be won or lost in the region, ADB is certainly committed to supporting our developing member countries in addressing climate change and building climate resilience. We are currently adopting a cooperative, multi-regional, and multi-sectoral approach, as I mentioned earlier, with regards to the just transition, to be able to better respond to climate change while ensuring that we continue to move towards the sustainable development goals. This brings me to the second message that I would like to leave, and that is that we need to position ourselves some 5 to 10 years out to be ahead of the curve and recognize the very quickly changing landscape and the importance of looking forward to addressing these interconnected challenges will be key. And that's why we need to focus more and more in terms of that multidisciplinary approach, looking at integrated solutions. We can't do everything. We cannot do piecemeal. We have to work in integrating solutions that address these multiple development challenges. Now, this is best captured, and I'll give you a few examples in the idea of what we refer to as the green, inclusive, resilient recovery. But the inconvenient truth is that if we, again, address challenges piecemeal, we will simply not get there. And what do I mean by that? Well, just bringing a couple of examples of some of the projects that we've done. So we recently built a road that was completed in northern Vietnam. And in this case, we obviously needed to embody all of the knowledge that by way of climate modeling into the technical and feasibility requirements of this investment to meet what would typically be, say, a 1 in 20 year weather event, extreme weather event, that could otherwise destroy the road. Similarly, if we turn to another example linked to the food security crisis that we're facing, we certainly need to factor into our solutions climate change's impact on agriculture productivity. Similarly, and I'll hope to talk to this a little bit later on, the impact of agriculture on the ecosystems that we operate under. So there's never been a clear resolution on the importance of sustainability, and this, of course, involves better anticipating the potential impacts, building resilience to the multiple risks that we face, that our countries face, and aligning development along greener and more sustainable pathways. Moving on, we've also appreciated the importance of increasing the resource envelope for climate. So in 2021, I'd like to share with you that recognizing the urgency of the climate crisis and vulnerability of many of our countries, where, as many of you know, Asia Pacific is approximately responsible for 50% of global greenhouse gas emissions. We certainly needed to elevate our ambition to address some of the more acute constraints. So from the point of view of climate financing, and we know that the emphasis is on the impact, but nevertheless, in terms of the climate financing, we have committed, ADB is committed to $100 billion level of ambition, cumulatively own resources from 2019 to 2030. This amount is roughly divided into 2/3 for mitigation, 1/3 for adaptation. $12 billion of the $100 billion is derived from our private sector operations. So again, building beyond public sector. And this $12 billion is expected to leverage some $18 billion to $36 billion of additional private sector resources. Now, of course, the other side of the coin to the financing is to ensure that our pipeline of bankable projects is strong, is robust, and more importantly, is aligned with the Paris Agreement. Now, jointly with other multilateral development banks, ADB is committed to aligning our operations, all our ADB operations, with the Paris Agreement through a common methodology that looks at 100% full alignment. This target will be made by July 1st of next year on the sovereign pipeline, and approximately 85% of the non-sovereign pipeline, giving a little bit more time, and fully 100% of the non-sovereign pipeline by 1st of July of 2025. So we're building a little bit extra room on the private sector side. I mentioned before the energy policy. Now, of course, the energy sector will have a very significant role in this work. Given the importance of the energy sector to climate change, as I mentioned earlier, we introduced and approved the new energy policy for ADB. And here it's important to highlight that it commits to supporting a universal access to reliable and affordable energy services, while promoting, of course, the low carbon transition in the region. We will be helping our developing member countries to not just increase energy efficiency, but also deploy more renewable carbon energy, and of course, integrate climate and disaster resilience into energy sector operations. The energy policy formalizes the institution's current practice of not financing new coal-fired power plants or heating plants. We will support a planned phase-out of coal in the region, and we commit to a just transition that promotes prosperous, inclusive, and resiliency in terms of sustainable livelihoods across all affected communities. ADB is currently also developing a climate change action plan. This plan will aim to contribute to placing Asia Pacific well onto resilience trajectory and a key driver of climate change mitigation. It will identify actions to be taken to advance ADB's DMC's capacity. And here I have to emphasize that there's a tremendous amount of work in terms of capacity development and making sure that there is a clear understanding of what those trade-offs are, what those commitments imply for many of our countries. And of course, that enables them to take greater leadership in becoming strong actors in the climate change agenda. Under the action plan, ADB will, of course, increase its focus on upstream engagement with our DMCs. This goes back to the convening power that I mentioned, being able to have that dialogue through country diagnostics, addressing policy, institutional, and other constraints, and of course, exchange of knowledge, which is very important to get a full understanding. We'll also be supporting implementation of the national determined contributions, as well as more rigorous national adaptation plans and long-term carbon and climate resilient development strategies, or LTS. These are all very important contributing factors to get a better absorptive capacity in terms of the climate change challenge. Lastly, I'm going to touch briefly on some other considerations on climate change challenges. Here, I'd like to mention that given the latest developments across the global economy, that very quickly changing landscape, many may ask, what is the current predicament regarding our global commons? I think the short answer is that it is hard to tell. Following on the Russian war in Ukraine, and the implication on global gas supplies. Coal power stations, many instances have reopened, and there are hard facts now supporting that. But at the same time, there is evidence that renewable energy projects have been accelerated. The reality is that there are many, quote, fires burning, unquote, and literally and metaphorically, including, of course, the energy crisis, the food crisis that I referred to before, a security crisis. And these come, of course, against the backdrop of some degree of exhaustion and limited fiscal headroom from the COVID-19 pandemic. So I think that it's clear that there's a lot of work to be done, and there are moving targets and multiple challenges to address. This brings me to my last message, and that is ultimately, if we are going to achieve our net zero targets, it will certainly come down to how much we are willing to change our consumption habits. Indeed, it is our unsustainable consumption path that is at the heart of what drives our unsustainable economic growth paths. Mitigation will have to go hand in hand with adaptation. Our own efforts to reduce our carbon consumption will be fundamental, and we'll have to complement efforts not just to preserve, but also to grow our carbon sinks, including removing carbon continuously through natural sequestration. I'll be happy to elaborate further on these points on Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Very interesting point about us having to adapt our lifestyles, perhaps. But let's move Takemoto-san on to you. Takemoto-san, I said is program head at UNU-IAS. He leads the UNU-IAS work on climate change and sustainable development, and has previous experience with the Global Environment Facility and at the Ministry of the Environment in Japan.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chairperson. Good afternoon, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. So it is my great pleasure to have a presentation at Foreign Correspondents Club. Sorry, can you hear me? Okay, yeah, very glad to speak. Yeah. So today's presentation, firstly, perhaps all of you don't understand United Nations University, so I briefly introduce this. And my main part is to focus on synergy between climate action and sustainable development. And finally, I would like to introduce our commitment. So next slide, please. Yes, UNU was established in 1972, nearly 40 years ago, as an autonomous UN agency whose headquarters are based in Tokyo. UNU currently has 13 institutes across the globe, located in 12 different countries. We serve as a bridge between the United Nations and international academic community, provides platform for global and local dialogue and creative new ideas. So we are not general university. We are a UN agency. The next one, please. Then UNU has one institute, Institute for the Advanced Study of Sustainability, based in Tokyo. This is my institute. And we are a research and teaching institute dedicated to realizing sustainable development through policy-oriented research, education, and capacity development. We serve the international community, providing evidence-based knowledge and solutions to inform policymakers making and address priority issues for the UN system. Now we are implementing academic activities around the 4 areas. Showing here, governance, biodiversity, water, and education. Then we are doing interdisciplinary research. Then our strategy is to integrate these expertise across disciplines in both academic and policymaking to mobilize knowledge for sustainability. As I said, we are not university. However, our institute has a very unique function. We have a postgraduate degree program. Then this is only one international institute that offers master's and doctoral degrees. These programs have 38 students, equally balanced between the 2 programs, 50-50% gender balance. And most of the students are from developing countries, it's about 76%, and supported by a range of different scholarships. The program are implemented through strong partnership with universities such as University of Tokyo, which provide our students with access to over 120 different courses. These partnerships also enable students to obtain a double degree or joint diploma. Next one, please. Okay, so now let me talk about climate change. But for today, I also talk about sustainable development and SDGs. Why? Climate change is accelerating, with worsening impacts across the globe. The growing energy crisis is pouring billions more dollars into fossil fuel, hampering the global commitment to realizing decarbonization by mid-century to achieve the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal of the Paris Agreement. At the same time, we are nearing the midpoint of the implementation for the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which was adopted at the UN in 2015. But the world is facing multiple serious challenges, which are placing progress on the SDGs in peril. We are also in the midst of building back better from the COVID-19 pandemic, while the conflict in Ukraine has triggered a global energy crisis. So there are a lot of challenges. So, and also climate change is cross-cutting. Its impact is jeopardizing achievements of all dimensions of sustainable development. So, and it has disproportionately impacts burden for the poorest and most vulnerable people. So, if we don't carefully plan the climate action without caring 5P of the sustainable development, 5P is people, prosperity, planet, peace, and partnership. If not, many of our current initiatives and investments will be in vain. The next one, please. So urgent action to hold climate and deal with impact is integral to successfully achieving all SDGs. So this figure shows the social and actions for social agendas, such as securing food or creation of safeguard community in the cities that will enhance resilience to disaster and contribute to adapt to impacts of climate change. This is an example of synergizing action between climate and action and SDGs in social aspect. The next one, please. And economic dimensions. Building zero-emission houses, businesses, and industries promoting energy efficiencies, creating green jobs in renewable energy and recycling initiatives that will contribute to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The next one. Even environmental dimensions, actions for reducing a negative impact on the environment, promoting renewables and reducing food waste, and promoting green mobility that will also contribute to climate change mitigation and adaptation actions. So next. So all the actions for sustainable development will be beneficial for reducing greenhouse gases and enhancing resilience against the impacts of climate change. So therefore, we need to enhance synergies and reduce trade-offs between climate change and sustainable development to achieve multiple goals for the 2000 agendas and the Paris Agreement simultaneously. But so current actions is not sufficient. So what should we do? How can we do? So let me provide a hint for such an action. The next one, please. Yeah, we must shift the current traditional silo approach, tackling with each environmental, social, and economic issue in individual way into a more systemic approach, transforming key socioeconomic systems such as urban, energy, food, and water. I believe that the ADB has a very active to promote such an approach. Such systemic approach will be able to produce multiple benefits, not single, two double benefits, such as low carbon and climate resilient development, conservation of biodiversity, prevention of land degradation, as well as poverty alleviation, provision of clean water, green jobs, economic growth, and reduce inequality. Next one. So the UN Global Sustainable Development Report was published in 2019. It called for integrated action across six key entry points for transformation of systems, such as urban, energy, and food systems. They are the most efficient way to break the silos between different goals. As they are promoted, intervened by key levels such as governance, finance, science and technology, and partnerships. Then let me point out a couple of examples on the systems. First one is energy system. Decarbonized energy, that will require universal access. So in the case of Global South. So according to the report on tackling SDGs 7 Energy Progress Report 2022, published by IEA and its partners. Sorry, next one, please. Sorry, this report. Global electricity access rate rose markedly between 2010 and 2020 from 83% to 91%. The number of people without access to electricity declined from 1.2 billion in 2010 to 733 million in 2020, thanks to double the number of people connected to mini grids. However, electrification, sorry, next one, please. Next slide, please. Sorry. Back. That's okay. Sorry. Yes, this one. Yes. However, electrification will remain 92% in 2030. It is assumed that we cannot achieve 100% access due to complexity of reaching the remaining unserved populations and potential impacts of COVID-19. And also 2.4 billion people remained without access to clean cooking in 2020. So this has led to millions of deaths each year from breathing cooking smoke, air pollution. Next slide, please. So let's look at the developed countries and all over the countries. So this is not the only issue in developing countries. So inclusive and equal access to clean energy is challenging, even for Japan, I believe. So because investing in clean energy and energy efficiency solutions presents financial challenges at this initial stage, in particular, under the current global energy crisis. While low awareness of clean energy benefits, which are given in the mid and long term, poses a great non-financial challenges to the investment. So their full potential to access to clean energy would be realized if social and economic incentives and support measures were strengthened and widely implemented. Our institute analyzed how many developed countries provided support to vulnerable energy users, such as low-income households and small and medium enterprises, through analysis on the recent national communication to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change submitted by 23 developed countries. The analysis shows that 11 countries out of 23, this is 48%, support low-income households, and 10 countries support SMEs for implement climate mitigation actions. So they are less than 50%. So we observed that there is a room to enhance support measures for such energy vulnerable users, even in developed countries, to realize net zero emission, because everyone needs access to clean energy, even in Japan. So this is a new observation from us. Next one, please. So the next example is a food system. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, 23 to 42% of global greenhouse gas emissions are associated with food system. This is a huge figure. There are also challenges for SDGs, such as widespread food security and malnutrition. The next slide, please. So both supply and demand side measures are important for reducing greenhouse gases in the food system. The IPCC's report demonstrates that there is a huge potential of greenhouse gas emission reduction through demand side management. For example, please look at the right-hand figures on the blue bar. I explain. It is possible to reduce as many as 8 gigaton of CO2 equivalent by socioeconomic factors such as shift in dietary choice with reduced animal protein, for example, from beef to vegetables, or avoid food waste and avoid overconsumption. At the same time, these actions will contribute to protect land degradation, conserve biodiversity, and curbing nitrogen phosphorus levels, reducing pollutions. So next slide, please. So let me summarize my points. We must enhance synergies between climate action and sustainable development to simultaneously achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement and SDGs. We need to break the silos between the goals. In order to do that, we must transform key systems like urban energy, food, and water, and others. Energy decarbonization must be realized with no one left behind. And for food system, sustainable food system will be realized through both supply and demand side measures. And for example, dietary shift and avoiding food loss will produce multiple co-benefits. Next one, please. Fine. And then last week, the third global conference on strengthening synergy between Paris Agreement and 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development was held at our university, gathering more than 130 speakers and 2,000 participants on-site and online from across the world. This is the biggest conference, real conference since the pandemic happened in Tokyo, I believe. As a result of the conference, it is found that evidence on the synergy is fragmented for most socioeconomic systems, except for urban systems. And it is also found there are huge knowledge gaps remaining in nexus between climate and SDGs, particularly for social agendas like SDGs 4, education, 5, gender, and 10, reduce inequality. And also essential to enhance partnership with stakeholders representing various sectors, and also to empower youth. From this context, UNU and its partners play a critical role for closing knowledge gaps by enhancing research and outreach knowledge through partnership at the global, national, and local levels. This is the last slide, please. So in this context, I'd like to highlight that we are developing a new postgraduate degree specialization on the Paris Agreement to be delivered from autumn 2023. It will be the first of its kind to be offered by UN organizations. The learners in this program will develop skills to play a leading role in implementing the Paris Agreement and sustainable development that is to achieve decarbonization and build resilience and sustainable society in the coming decades. That's all. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, we'll move on now to Takizawa-san, who is as I said, a policy researcher at Climate and Energy Division of the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, which was established in 1998 under an initiative of the Japanese government and with support of Kanagawa Prefecture. The aim of the Institute is to conduct innovative policy development and strategic research for environmental measures, reflecting the results of research into political decisions for realizing sustainable development in the Asia-Pacific region and globally. So, Takizawa-san, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Anthony Roney, for your kind introduction. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great pleasure to speak at the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. My name is Hajime Takizawa, policy researcher, Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, IGES. IGES is a research institute established by Ministry of Environment, but my analysis is fair, neutral and independent from the government. My topic for today is Japan's coal power policy. G7 countries, except Japan, announced coal phase out. Instead of coal phase out, Japan's coal policy is coal firing with ammonia. Ammonia itself does not emit CO2 when it burns. So by using ammonia as a fuel and reducing amount of coal firing with ammonia could reduce CO2 emissions. And in case of ammonia 100% mono firing, zero emission thermal power generation is possible, theoretically. But in practice, ammonia coal firing has some challenges. Today, I'd like to show these challenges and encourage the Japanese government to accelerate coal phase out for energy transition. Let's begin. Global fight against climate change is urgent. Last month at the G7 in Germany, G7 leaders agreed that coal power generation is the single biggest cause of global temperature increase. In the communique, G7 commits to accelerating phase out of domestic coal power generation and achieving a fully decarbonized power sector by 2035. G7 countries, except Japan, will close all the coal power plants by a certain period of time. New coal power plants in Japan are still under construction. Instead of coal phase out, Japan's coal power policy is a fade out of inefficient coal power plants. Ministry of Economy has divided coal power plants into two groups: inefficient power plants and highly efficient power plants. Japan's coal fade out of inefficient power plants is closing all the inefficient plants. Next, please. There are some types of coal power plants exist. Left graph shows CO2 emissions from different types of coal power plants. From left to right, plants become more advanced, efficient, which means lower CO2 emissions. Please compare CO2 emissions of each plant. It's true that highly efficient plants are lower emissions than inefficient plants, but the difference is less than 10%. And highly efficient plants continue to be constructed and increase from 22 gigawatt in 2019 to 27 gigawatt in 2030. In addition, inefficient plants are going to be closed, but they will not become zero. There are loopholes to escape from the fade-out scheme. Captive power plants are self-generation, self-consuming coal power plants. Steel, cement, and chemical companies have their own coal power plants. These captive power plants are exempt from this fade-out scheme. So the total coal power capacity between 2019 and 2030 is almost the same level. For this reason, Japan receives criticism from the global community. Then towards 2050 carbon neutral. Switching fuel from coal to ammonia is Japan's coal power policy. Let's look into this policy in the next slide. Next, please. Left table shows government's roadmap of coal ammonia co-firing. As a fuel, ammonia is compatible with coal, but its combustion temperature and speed are different. Currently, 20% coal ammonia co-firing is being tested at a pilot plant. The government is planning to increase co-firing ratio and establish 100% ammonia-fired power generation by 2050. In that case, huge amount of ammonia is necessary as alternative fuel. Right graph shows how much ammonia Japan needs as co-firing ratio increases. At the moment, global ammonia trade is 20 million tons per year. And in Japan, only 1 million tons is consumed as fertilizer. For example, switching 20% of coal to ammonia at the entire coal power plants in Japan, 20 million tons of ammonia is required, which is equal to global ammonia trade. In case of 50%, 50 million tons. In 100%, 100 million tons required. Such a huge amount of ammonia is not available around the world. Therefore, Ministry of Economy established Public-Private Council on Fuel Ammonia Introduction. And trading companies and power companies are trying to establish ammonia supply chain in the world. Next one, please. Left map shows potential supply chains from the Middle East, Australia, and Chile. Ammonia is made of hydrogen and nitrogen. In the Middle East, ammonia is made by using natural gas. In Australia, hydrogen is made by using coal. In Chile, ammonia is made by electrolysis water using renewable energy. This is called green ammonia, but the most expensive method among the three methods. From coal must be heated for gasification by more than 1000 degrees Celsius. This is also expensive. The least expensive method is using natural gas. Right graph compares power generation cost of coal ammonia co-firing. Coal 100% is 10.4 yen per kilowatt hour. Ammonia 20% is 20% more expensive. Finally, ammonia 100% is 2.3 times more expensive, even though using natural gas. Transportation cost by sea is a bottleneck. On the other hand, power generation cost of renewable energy is getting cheaper. But ammonia-fired power generation is far from cost-effective, even though it's CO2-free. Ministry of Economy is trying to decrease the cost by technology development, but the possibility of cost reduction is a big challenge. Next one, please. Switching from coal to ammonia could reduce CO2 emissions. Left graph shows potential CO2 reduction by coal ammonia co-firing from the statistics of Ministry of Economy. Orange bar is the current CO2 emissions from power sector using coal, natural gas, and oil. In case of 20% ammonia co-firing, 40 million tons of CO2 could be reduced. In 50%, 100 million tons. In case of 100% ammonia, 200 million tons, about half of total CO2 emissions from power sector in Japan, could be reduced. But CO2 emissions must be seen as a whole life cycle from the beginning of ammonia manufacture. Right graph shows CO2 emissions from ammonia manufacture studied by National Australian University. Black bar is emission savings in case of ammonia 20%, 40 million tons of CO2. The right next blue bar is emissions of ammonia manufacture from natural gas without emission reduction measures such as carbon capture and storage. It's the same 40 million tons. So the emission savings would be balanced by similar increase, and there's no net benefit for global emissions. Climate change must be tackled by the entire global community. CO2 reduction by ammonia co-firing also must be seen from the total life cycle emissions. Next one, please. For wrap up, Japan's coal fade out and ammonia co-firing policy has some challenges, such as technology, currently 20%, high cost of power generation, insufficient ammonia supply, and CO2 emissions of unabated fossil ammonia. They must be cleared, otherwise Japan's carbon neutral could not be achieved. Japan should follow suit with G7 and accelerate coal phase out. Next year, Japan will host G7. As chair country, Japan should more commitments and lead the world in the climate change and decarbonization policy. That's my main point for today's presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Okay, let's move on to our final speaker, perhaps a slightly different perspective. The Reverend Fletcher Harper is a pioneer in the involvement of faith groups in the environmental movement. He's helped to spearhead the faith-based fossil fuel divestment movement, and he organizes faith turnouts at major climate mobilizations. So,
thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity to be here, and expression of appreciation to Takemoto-san and Takizawa-san for their excellent presentations, and to Mr. Carrasco also out there in the Ethernet. I'd like to talk about this issue from a slightly different vantage point, as may be clear from my Christian clerical collar uniform. I'm not a technical expert, I'm not an engineer, and I'm not a policy expert. I am a religious leader, and I am an activist. And with a full understanding of the complex moment here in Japan in terms of the public role of religion within society, I'd like to offer a couple of reflections to augment and complement what my colleagues have said. Earlier this week, I had the opportunity to speak to a group of religious youth here in Japan, between the ages of 20 and 30 years old. And I've done this with youth from a wide range of religions around the world. And what I heard and felt here in Tokyo was the same thing that I have felt in Rio de Janeiro, in New York, in London, in Paris, in Nairobi. Over and over and over again, what young people express is a palpable sense of fear, of disorientation, of depression, and of uncertainty about the nature of their own future. And their honesty and directness and guilelessness about this is something that adults in the room and on the margins of these conversations find liberating, because we all, if we are honest, harbor those emotions deep within us in relationship to the crisis that we face. We all know that the world is not on track to meet the goals that have been set, and we know that that gap is dangerously large. And so I'd like to start by seeking to suggest that allowing our conversations about this topic to be grounded in that sobering reality is a necessary part of the way that we must discuss this issue. Too often, those who seek to prevent necessary action on climate change employ very sophisticated, albeit highly cynical, communication strategies to assure us that everything can and will be okay. And they do that to relieve anxiety in a way, as a way of supporting business as usual and the status quo. An iconic example of that, referenced earlier here at the club by Dylan Tanner from Influence Map, was ExxonMobil's deployment of an advertising campaign touting its own production of energy from biofuels, when the budget for the advertising campaign was actually larger than the budget for the biofuel production project itself. The level of cynicism involved in that is widespread and is unconscionable at a human level. And yet it persists. And so as organization, GreenFaith, the organization I serve, works with religious and spiritual communities around the world. And we seek to address this issue from the perspective of widely shared human values, of integrity, and of compassion. Here in the East, we say harmony and balance. In the West, we say justice. The words differ in different regions, but there is enormous common ground in terms of the underlying values that we all recognize are absolutely fundamental to the fabric of human civilization. And yet public discourse about this, both from the corporate sector and too often from the political sphere, is infected by an ultimately deadly level of dishonesty and of a lack of compassion, a lack of truthfulness. This needs to change. Religions need to play a much bigger role than they do. I am the first to say that around the globe, for sure in my own home country of the United States, but in many other countries also, religion may well have been more of the problem than the solution, at times by an outdated worldview that sees humanity as separate from the natural world, its master, its dominator, and at times religious groups, and in this case, particularly evangelical Christian groups, bear a particular level of culpability for supporting a drill, baby, drill mindset that in no way represents the real values of their religion. We see this in Brazil also, where an administration that meets many criteria for literal insanity uses religion to justify the invasion of the Amazon, the widespread violation of the rights of indigenous peoples, and this destruction of one of the hopes of the planet for future climate stability. I was so glad to hear Takizawa-san talk about the misguided commitment to coal that Japan clings to unnecessarily. We see over and over and over again a disregard for the fact that renewable technologies exist, are deployable at scale with simple, sensible, renewable policies. And yet we also see major industrial extractive fossil fuel interests subverting the process of the development of those policies for the sheer reason of self-preservation. And while this may on some sociological level be an understandable impulse, it must be recognized now widely and openly for what it is, which is a sentence that will subject hundreds of millions of innocent people around the globe to suffering, to displacement, to poverty, and many to death. So where do we stand and what do we need to do? There is, I believe, an Irish saying, perhaps not so suitable for Japan, but I'll share it nonetheless, about is this a private argument or can anyone get involved? We take hope from the fact that over and over again, we see leadership from young people, from select people of faith. We're part of a new movement that we think has promise called the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which says very simply that there must be, as a complement to the Paris Agreement, a binding international agreement to say that there will be no more new fossil fuel projects, that there will be an equitable decline in fossil fuel production, and that there will be a massive commitment to an equitable and just transition, particularly for heavily impacted countries, communities, and workers, so that no one's left behind. That's the kind of vision that reflects the moral and humanitarian and, at their best, religious values around this topic. And while some may scoff and say that it's a pipe dream or highly unrealistic, we encountered exactly the same reaction a decade ago at the outset of the fossil fuel divestment movement, where people thought that it was literally inconceivable to construct an investment portfolio of any size that did not include oil and gas companies. It was proven not only that that could be done, but that it appeared to be, and research has proven out, is in many cases more profitable to invest in that kind of way. Assets under management committed to some form of divestment have grown to the trillions of dollar level, it absolutely is possible. And what I would say is, in the secular use of the term belief, much of it depends on our willingness to believe that this vision of a sustainable and equitable future is real. Ultimately, from our perspective, and perhaps it's inevitable coming from a religious group, much of this does come down to a question of belief. Do we believe the appealing, anxiety-easing, ultimately untrue narratives promulgated by fossil fuel industries and by governments committed to the status quo and its preservation as long as possible? Or do we have the courage to believe in a different kind of future, one that certainly poses challenges, but that is possible and that is absolutely necessary for the future of the planet and of all people? So my friends, I would say we have excellent knowledge and research and education that shows how this pathway, where it needs to lead and how it can be done. And we need a corresponding upsurge at an enormously broad civil society level to say to the leaders of the world, not only you can, but you must. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Some sincerely profound points. A question I quickly would like to put to all the panelists is, are we losing the race against time? The more research that's done into climate change, the more it becomes obvious that the problem is extremely complex and time-consuming. So, but we have limited time. I mean, as we look at what's happening around us now, heat waves and all kinds of things, it seems, perhaps wrongly, that things are getting worse faster. So if it's decided that it's not possible to do all the things that we've been talking about, you know, the desirable things like sustainable development and so on, and that an emergency is actually almost upon us, what can be the priorities to speed up the absolute bare minimum and essentials that are required to prevent us all baking or drowning? I mean, I'm putting it in very crude terms. Mr. Carrasco first, if you don't mind. Are you pessimistic or optimistic that we're keeping pace, at least in the race, or not?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that question. I hope you can hear me. I am someone who is largely optimistic, but with an important sense of realism in terms of what is the challenge ahead of us. If we look at many of the statistics, it is indeed frightening where we're at as far as the planet is concerned, and you know, it's certainly a very daunting task that we face. In terms of one of the data points that I like to refer to is the fast extinction of many species, and the challenge in some ways to biodiversity. So that is one that really comes out very, very strongly. So, for example, the IPCC estimates that a 1.5 degrees Celsius average rise in temperature may put 20 to 30% of species at risk of extinction. So I think that, to me, is quite a clear sign of where we're at. If we look at many of the other statistics in terms of what has to be done, I also wanted to share that between 2001 and 2019, forests have been we've been losing forest coverage at a very, very rapid speed. According to the World Bank estimates, we've lost more than 1 million square miles of forest cover since 1990. And by current rates of destruction, the world's tropical rainforests, our greatest stores of biodiversity and carbon, will disappear in 100 years. So we can go on with these stark figures. I do think that we need in the next few years a sense of greater realism, greater recognition of what needs to be done. We do, and going back to some of the discussion points earlier today, we do have tremendous weight on technology, but we have to recognize the risks of the application of that technology. We recognize the tremendous promises in terms of renewable energy, solar, wind, hydro. MDBs no longer do hydro. There are a lot of implications. That is something that one may want to look at. We have, of course, a lot of the work that is going on in terms of carbon capture and storage, green hydrogen, waste to energy, etc. But again, we have to recognize that there is a cost to a lot of the newer technologies, that many of the countries, developing countries, do not have access to that technology. And this will be fundamental if we are to win the battle on climate change. I would say that COP27 is key in terms of how we place ourselves following on COP26. We recognize that we have, as I mentioned earlier, the nationally determined contributions. We have to have a sense of realism there, that we need to be much more ambitious. But at the same time, and we haven't brought this dimension into our discussion, we have the role of governments and politicians. And going back, I think, to Fletcher's point, we have to be honest with ourselves. And I think that political leaders need to, in many ways, own up to that sense of realism. There will be tremendous costs in terms of what I was referring to earlier, the consumption costs. There are very important, significant changes to our lifestyle. Are we willing to do that? Question mark. I liked also a point that I think, again, Fletcher made in terms of the young generations. They have a very different sense of what these challenges are than to say more the older generations. They have a greater stake in this, the intergenerational transformation that this would imply. So we need to have that greater discussion, greater onboarding. Finance is important, technology is important, but we have to bring it together. And I do think that time is running out. Let me pause there. Thank you.
Thank you. Takizawa-san, Takemoto-san, do you wish to add anything briefly to that? Yes, those are please.
I'm optimistic. Yeah, now what we should do is do more decarbonization policies to step forward. For talking about coal power generation, on Earth, there are 2,000 gigawatts of coal power plant exist in the world, and about half, 1,000 tons, exist in China. In the last year, COP26, China and India insist of coal phase down, not phase out. So this year's COP27, we should make every effort to get China and India involved in this decarbonization and move forward for coal phase out to achieve the 1.5 degree goal.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Takemoto-san?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah,
Yes, those are please.
yes, thank you.
Briefly.
Yeah, also, optimistic. I also had a chance to talk with a youth group at the last big conference held in Tokyo. Yeah, they are brilliant. They are all candidates of future leaders. So I believe they can lead our countries in the world in the future. So from this point of view, it's, yeah, so what it's saying, yeah, it's kotowaza isogaba maore. It's in English, slow and steady wins the race. So awareness raising and capacity building is critical. So because an IPCC report said, in order to achieve the carbon neutrality, social acceptance, this is necessary. Yeah, we experience these issues under the current energy crisis.
Okay.
So they're facing difficulty to choice higher.
Thank
Yes.
you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Let me just at this point ask whether there are any questions from the floor. Oh, yes. Yes.
Hello there. Thanks for coming to the club. I've enjoyed this talk so far. Just wanted to ask about one thing. One thing I haven't heard.
Sorry, can you identify yourself?
Sorry, it's Andy Sharp. I'm at Nikkei Asia.
Thank you.
One thing I haven't heard from any of you during this discussion is the N word, nuclear.
Nuclear.
So, to mitigate the impact of climate change, should Japan and other countries be ramping up their use of nuclear power until we get to the stage when we're getting close to using, say, 100% renewables? So is this a temporary option for the next few decades in the context of the bigger picture of climate change? And it could be a short answer maybe from each of the speakers.
Okay, well, let's turn to Mr. Carrasco very briefly. Can you briefly talk about nuclear, about its contribution and so on?
So thank you very much for that question. I can say that ADB, like multilateral development banks, we are off nuclear for many reasons. We do recognize that there is an increasing interest, and certainly across our member countries, in that option of the nuclear energy. It's still quite controversial. I understand that in Europe, there is an attempt to bring in nuclear as part of the renewable energy. We obviously need to look at that in more detail. The changing landscape suggests that we need to give that a strong consideration. However, we do have also the understanding that there are other considerations in terms of disposal of nuclear waste and other such problems. We've got obviously also the recent examples where we've seen across many countries the potential dangers. But I think it does suggest that we need to look into it more extensively to come up with an answer to your question. Thank you.
Thank you. Any comments on nuclear briefly? If you...
Thank you very much for your question. Yes, I believe nuclear power becomes one option for decarbonization. But especially in Japan, after Fukushima nuclear accident, the security measures was tightened. And all the nuclear power plant have to pass the security measures screening by Nuclear Regulation Authority. And one more big challenge is approval from the local government. And screening by Nuclear Regulation Authority takes many years. Some plants more than 5 years and even 10 years. After passing the screening, they have to get approval from the local government. But some Japanese people are filing a lawsuit against not to operate nuclear power plants. So in Japan, there are more than 20 operational nuclear power plants exist, but restarted only 10 plants. So another plants, whether they are restart or not, is nobody can predict. So nuclear power plant can be one option, but the Japanese government have to choose, depend on fossil fuel for the next decade. That's my answer. Thank you very much.
Yes, okay, yeah. So in terms of nuclear powers, there is synergy between sustainable development as well as trade-offs. So they need to overcome the issues on the environmental impact or security against the disaster and others. So I think there are lots of issues to be overcome. Thank you.
Just very briefly, I live in New Jersey in the United States, which has good renewable energy state solar policy. Over the last 6 years, the state has successfully installed as much solar capacity to generate the equivalent amount of electricity that would be generated by a medium-sized nuclear plant. Within 6 years, nuclear plants, all the lawsuits aren't even filed yet. So I think on a very practical level, what I fail to understand is why governments everywhere are not pushing the accelerator on scale up of renewable energy. It creates more jobs per economic input than nuclear and than fossil fuels. It's quicker and it's more stable in many ways because it creates a decentralized grid. So I think this is also particularly important in developing countries that need to increase energy access, where distributed solutions enable you to reach the people who are the last to be served often. And so there's a tremendous humanitarian benefit as well.
Okay. Yeah.
My name is Kurt Sieber. I'm an associate member, but I have been studying, not only talking about it, but doing it. Today, I think we had excellent presentations, and it's all true. But I'm missing one big one, and that is the renewables. That has must have a much higher status in the whole discussions. When I started on my roof with solar, the price of electricity was 48 kilowatt per kilowatt hour. Okay. Now it is down to 8.5. It's the cheapest energy which is available, and even the government is now accepting the fact that it is the cheaper, and it's cheaper than all other options. So.
Could you phrase it into a question?
Yeah, so the question is, why don't we, for 60 years in Japan, I have heard how Japan is a poor country without any raw materials, without any energy, etc., etc. The energy is right up here. You just have to pick it up. And actually, the power of the sun, which is in the world, is 5,000 times that it could cover the whole necessity of electricity. But it's too cheap, and it's not interesting to be cheap. My practical thing is, here I can check every moment how much my house is now producing. By the way, both the battery, which was specially installed, together with the local, with the solar as a whole. By the way, both 50% paid by the Japanese government from the center, from Tokyo, from Setagaya.
Okay, I will have to, sorry, but we're running right up against time. So.
Anyhow, my question is very simple. Why don't we talk more about renewables, solar and wind, which are really natural, available to Japan, and not depending on all these problems which we have on other.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask for answers on that. Before I do, I would note that some cynics say that the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow, but that's too cynical. So Bruno Carrasco first.
Thank you. So I don't know the specifics of Japan, so I will simply answer by saying that for us, the future is in renewable energy in terms of our portfolio of lending across our developing member countries. Solar, wind are driving that portfolio of energy work. We do recognize that across many technologies, the cost is coming down. Right now, we're more competitive than coal in large parts of the world. And going back to your earlier question, why I'm a cautious optimist, it's partly because we have solutions already with renewable. Obviously, that is continued work, and we do support that, and we expect much further advances in terms of the renewable and the price of that, which will increase its demand. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Renewables.
Thank you very much for your question. Renewable in Japan right now 20%, and according to strategic energy plan, in 2030, 30 to 40%, and even in 2050, renewables expected to be 50 to 60%. There's a long way to ROE 100% in Japan. But yes. In Japan, technology development is ongoing, and the cost is decreasing. So the solar power could rooftop and mega solar will increase more than we expected. Thank you very much.
Just so to make, yeah. I think this is because that happens in Japan due to the negative asset of coal-fire-oriented policy. So, but now the top leader declares to realize carbon neutrality. So this trend will change in the near future. Thank you.
Okay. Quick comment on?
Yeah, I think absolutely we need to stop coal, oil, and gas projects, and we need to ramp up renewables. I mean, there's a very simple choice, and we're at a fork in the road.
Okay, we are almost at 4 o'clock, but are there any more questions in the room? Oh yes, does it, please. Briefly, please, because we're running close on deadline.
Will Fee of the Japan Times. So the panelists have spoken of fears of young people.
Sorry, did you say who you were from?
Yeah, Will Fee of the Japan Times.
Oh, okay, right.
So the panelists have spoken of the fears of young people throughout the globe, yet we see general voter apathy everywhere among that age group and low voter turnout. How can young people be persuaded to play their part in the political process and policy making, by at the very least head into the polls, particularly as it is that younger generation who are going to inherit the bulk of the negative effects of the climate crisis that we're talking about?
Sorry, so I don't think how can young people be
organized to vote?
Yeah, be persuaded to take part in the political process as it is, as they're going to be the ones who inherit.
Let me answer briefly. So I think it is very important to provide an opportunity young people to be engaged in the policy making process or role playing to communicate with different kind of people, different kind of stakeholders. So for example, our institute has have a responsibility to provide such kind of platform to gather all kinds of young people to have a discussion, not only among young people, but also with other sectors. Thank you.
No other comment. I agree with Takemoto.
I think it points to the incredibly important role of civil society organizations, educational institutions, religious institutions that foster a sense of civic involvement and that organize collective actions that give younger people a chance to get involved in political processes. These behaviors happen not because individuals do things in an isolated sense. People do it as groups. And the political and religious right have been very effective in using those organizing processes to create power, to build power.
Okay, we did start a little late, which is my fault, I'm afraid, but if our panelists agree, I would like to ask one quick more question. That is on finance. Actually, I have a book coming out myself next month, which asks the question of who is going to pay for the cost of climate change mitigation and so on. My question very briefly is, do you regard this as a problem, something that's been rather overlooked? There's been so much research into so many aspects of climate change, but in many ways the question of where the money is coming from, the private sector, the public sector, do you think that question has been researched or looked at closely enough? I personally don't, but I'm not going to talk about my views here. So, Mr. Carrasco first. Are we ignoring the financial burden?
From the perspective of where I sit at Asian Development Bank, our job in some ways is to help contribute to the financing as well as to mobilize additional financing. I think that the question you pose requires certainly much greater recognition that we need to be able to leverage our resources much more effectively. We have not reached the optimum. We do recognize that, excuse me, private sector is going to have to come in. At ADB, we are looking at de-risking some of that pipeline to be able to attract greater private investment, and that also has some ways to go. We do recognize philanthropists are very important in this process of blended finance, but recognizing that financial aspect and how we can leverage more, I think, will be fundamental to the solution of climate change. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, yeah, thank you very much. From my experience working for Global Environment Facility as a funding agency to support climate change project in collaboration with others. So it is very important that climate finance has a very important role to leverage all kinds of relevant resources, financial resources from both public and private sectors, and to make impact investment in such a to transform the city for more sustainable, or to invest in the food system or more sustainable. That will produce the multiple benefits, not only climate, but also other kinds of sustainable development. That will gain acceptance by the taxpayers. Thank you.
My personal opinion is climate mitigation costs should covered by emitters, depending on their CO2 concentration. Carbon tax is one option to finance.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd say that the availability of money is going to be governed by the sense of priority that governments place on it. When the pandemic hit, governments found enormous sums of money because there was an understanding of urgency. So the absolute dollar amount is not as important as the sense of urgency that governments place. I also think that there are very clearly identified corporations that are responsible for a large share of historical emissions, and that those recently, we've all noticed, have been quite profitable. So I think that there are legitimate conversations about how that should happen. I would also say, again, from a religious perspective, there's a scandalous level of income inequality in the world, with enormous wealth concentration among a relatively small number of people. To me, I think that there need to be conversations about how wealth is deployed at a global scale for climate and SDG-related projects. There is enough money in the world.
Okay, thank you. Well, we could go on and on, I think, and perhaps we'll have future sessions, but we are unfortunately at the end of our time. Thank you all for contributing your expertise, not least Mr. Carrasco, although you're not with us physically. It's our practice here to present speakers like yourselves with 1-year honorary membership of the club. Mr. Carrasco, I'm afraid I can't pass this to you by Zoom, but it will be sent to you. But Takizawa-san, here's your 1-year honorary membership. To Takemoto-san.
Thank you so much.
To Fletcher, thank you for your contribution.